Nathaniel Brooks had always lived a quiet life. He came from a wealthy family, raised with the comforts that wealth could bring: a large, beautiful home, well-educated, and shielded from the harsh realities of the world. His father, Elias Brooks, was a powerful man in their town. He owned the most land and was respected by everyone. Growing up, Nathaniel never had to worry about things like money, food, or shelter. His world was one of ease and calm, and he was content with it. But what Nathaniel didn't know was that his life was about to change in a way that would challenge everything he thought he knew. His father, a man of few words but strong opinions, had been speaking with someone in private for weeks. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the orange glow filled the room, Elias sat Nathaniel down in the study. It was a room filled with dusty old books, framed paintings of ancestors, and the faint smell of cigars that had long since been extinguished. Nathaniel could tell by the serious look on his father's face that this conversation would not be like the others. "You are a man now, Nathaniel," his father began, looking him in the eye. "And it's time you started acting like one. Your mother and I have made arrangements." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to guess what this was about. He had no idea what arrangements his father was talking about, but he was about to find out. "The O'Connors are a good family," Elias continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "And Maggie O'Connor is a woman you will marry." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. He didn't know the O'Connors well, but he had heard enough rumors to know that the O'Connor name wasn't one to be taken lightly. Maggie O'Connor was the youngest daughter of the O'Connor family, and she was known around town for running the most popular and, by some accounts, the wildest saloon. It was a business full of loud music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. She wasn't the type of woman who was expected to be a quiet housewife. No, Maggie O'Connor was bold, outspoken, and not afraid to speak her mind, even if it meant stepping on a few toes. Nathaniel's face turned pale. This was not the life he had imagined for himself. The thought of marrying someone like Maggie O'Connor felt foreign to him. He was a gentleman, a product of a life where appearances mattered, where tradition and dignity came first. Maggie O'Connor, on the other hand, was everything he had been taught to avoid: someone who lived outside the rules of society. She was brash, confident, and unafraid of what people thought of her. And yet, his father had arranged this marriage as a way to strengthen their family's ties with the O'Connors. "Father, I don't understand," Nathaniel stammered. "Maggie O'Connor? You can't be serious." Elias sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're a man of privilege, Nathaniel. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. But you must learn that life doesn't always give you the choices you want. Sometimes you have to do what's best for the family, and this marriage is what's best for our future. The O'Connors are important. Their influence will help us expand our land and reach." Nathaniel felt a knot grow in his stomach. He didn't want this. He didn't want a marriage built on business and family alliances. He wanted a life of his own, to choose who he married, someone he could love. But his father's words were final. The deal had been made, and Nathaniel had no choice but to go along with it. In the days that followed, Nathaniel's unease only grew. He tried to avoid thinking about the upcoming wedding, but it was impossible. Everywhere he went, he overheard whispers about Maggie O'Connor. Some spoke of her with admiration, saying she was a strong and independent woman who didn't let anyone tell her what to do. Others spoke less kindly, calling her reckless, wild, and unsuitable for a man of Nathaniel's status. On the morning of the wedding, Nathaniel stood in front of a full-length mirror in his family's grand home. He was dressed in a suit that had been tailored just for this occasion, his hair neatly combed, his face pale and tense. As he straightened his tie, his mind raced. What was he doing? What kind of life was he stepping into? Was he really going to marry a woman who lived in a saloon? A woman who had no interest in the same things he did? When he arrived at the church, Nathaniel felt his stomach churn with nerves. The ceremony was set to take place in front of a large crowd. Family, friends, and those who were connected to the O'Connors. Nathaniel couldn't help but feel out of place. The grandeur of the church, the beautiful flowers, and the soft music made it feel like something straight out of a fairy tale. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was his reality. As the doors opened, Nathaniel caught his first glimpse of Maggie. She walked down the aisle with a confidence that left him speechless. Her gown was nothing like the modest dresses he had imagined for a bride. It was bold, flashy, and made her stand out in a way that seemed almost intentional. She wasn't shy or demure like the women he had known. No, Maggie O'Connor was fierce, her every step radiating power. Nathaniel couldn't help but stare, his mind still in disbelief. This was the woman he was about to marry? When their eyes met, Maggie's gaze was unwavering. There was no softness in her look, only a quiet challenge, as if she already knew what Nathaniel was thinking and didn't care. In that moment, he understood something: this marriage was not going to be easy. It wasn't going to be filled with the quiet dinners and peaceful evenings he had once dreamed of. No, this was going to be a test of everything he thought he knew about life and love. The ceremony itself felt like a blur. Nathaniel repeated his vows, the words barely making sense as they left his lips. He could feel Maggie's eyes on him, watching him with an intensity that made him feel vulnerable. The priest asked them to exchange rings, and when Maggie placed the band on his finger, her touch was firm and confident, as if she were marking her territory. The whole event felt like a business transaction, a duty fulfilled. As they exited the church and the crowd cheered, Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? What was he supposed to do now? He had married a woman he barely knew, a woman who seemed to have no interest in the same things he did. And yet, something about her intrigued him, something about the way she carried herself, the way she didn't care what others thought, made Nathaniel feel like there was more to her than what he had been told. As they drove away from the church in the carriage, Nathaniel sat beside Maggie, unsure of what to say. The journey to their new home was silent, the air thick with tension. He stole glances at Maggie, who stared out the window, seemingly lost in thought. Nathaniel could feel the weight of their new life ahead of them, but he didn't know what it would bring. He only knew one thing for sure: nothing about this marriage would be easy. The carriage ride to their new home was long, and the air between Nathaniel and Maggie was thick with an unspoken tension. The town's streets seemed to blur into one long stretch of unfamiliarity as they made their way toward the saloon. Nathaniel had never been to the place, and as they turned a corner, he caught his first glimpse of it. The saloon wasn't like the grand houses he was accustomed to, nor did it have the polished charm of his own family's estate. Instead, it was an imposing, weathered building, standing tall and proud on the edge of the main street. It had a worn, rustic quality to it, with a large sign that hung loosely above the door, swaying slightly in the breeze. The place looked like it had seen years of laughter, quarrels, and hard work. Maggie didn't look back at him as they approached the building, but Nathaniel could sense that she felt at home here. For her, this was her domain, a world she had built from the ground up, while he, on the other hand, was a stranger, walking into a world he didn't understand. The moment they arrived, Maggie stepped down from the carriage first, her movements swift and confident, as though she had done this countless times before. Nathaniel hesitated before following her, unsure of what awaited him. As he stood beside her, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The air was different here, thicker, more charged with life and energy than what he was used to. It was louder, filled with the voices of people talking, laughing, and the clinking of glasses. Inside, the saloon was just as he had imagined, but more alive than he had expected. The room was dimly lit, with smoky air hanging in the corners. The scent of alcohol and the sound of piano music blended with the chatter of men and women enjoying themselves. A few of the local regulars turned their heads as Maggie walked in, nodding or smiling in greeting, as if they were all familiar with her. Nathaniel felt their eyes on him too, but it wasn't the welcoming kind of gaze he was used to. No, it was curious, like they were trying to figure him out. Maggie made her way behind the bar without a second glance at Nathaniel. She moved with purpose, taking the reins of the place with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She was the one in control, and it was clear that she didn't need anyone else to tell her what to do. Nathaniel stood near the door for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. The room felt like a different world, one he wasn't sure he belonged to. He watched Maggie as she spoke with a few of the customers, laughing easily with them. There was a confidence about her, a natural ease in her own skin that Nathaniel couldn't ignore. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself, it was all so different from anything he had ever known. He was used to polite conversation, to soft words, and controlled manners. But Maggie? She was direct, unafraid to say exactly what was on her mind. After a moment of hesitation, Nathaniel made his way to a table by the window, trying to avoid being the center of attention. He didn't want to make a scene, but at the same time, he was out of place here. He looked around the room, his eyes settling on a group of men who were deep in conversation, their laughter punctuated by the occasional burst of loud words. Nathaniel could feel the heat of the room, the warmth of the whiskey being passed around, and the energy that seemed to pulse in the air. Minutes passed, and Maggie eventually approached him, her eyes sharp and assessing as she took a seat across from him at the table. She didn't say anything at first, merely observing him with a quiet intensity that made Nathaniel shift uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was something about her that made him nervous, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "You look like you don't belong here," Maggie finally said, her voice steady but tinged with amusement. Nathaniel blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. I'm just getting used to it," he muttered, feeling a flush rise to his cheeks. Maggie raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his discomfort. "You don't have to be shy. These people aren't going to bite you. Well, most of them anyway," she added with a teasing smile. Her tone, playful, but sharp. Nathaniel couldn't help but stare at her, trying to figure out what kind of person she really was. She was so different from the women he had known, so unlike anything he had been prepared for. He had imagined a quiet, reserved woman who would share his interests, who would make the transition into married life smooth and gentle. But Maggie, she was bold, brash even. She was everything that was unfamiliar to him. "How long have you run this place?" Nathaniel asked, his voice a little less shaky now. He was curious, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been running this place for years. It's mine. I built it from the ground up. This is where I belong," she said, her tone full of pride. Nathaniel's mind raced as he tried to digest what she had said. She didn't just work here, she owned it. This was her world, her life, and she was proud of it. There was no hesitating, no second guessing. Maggie had made something for herself, and she had no intention of letting anyone take it away from her. "You're not like the women I'm used to," Nathaniel said, before he could stop himself. His words hung in the air between them, awkward, but truthful. Maggie smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp, a little knowing, as if she had heard this before, and wasn't surprised. "You think I'm some sort of wild woman who doesn't know how to behave, don't you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, her gaze never faltering. Nathaniel swallowed, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't meant to offend her, but he couldn't deny what he was thinking. Everything about Maggie was different, her confidence, her straightforwardness, her refusal to conform to the expectations of society. She was everything he was told to avoid, and yet, in some strange way, he found himself drawn to her. Before he could say anything, Maggie stood up abruptly, brushing her dress off as she turned toward the bar. "I'll be in the back if you need me," she said, her voice cold and distant now, as if the conversation was over. Nathaniel watched her walk away, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He was confused, uncertain, and a little overwhelmed. He had married a woman who was completely unlike what he had imagined, and now he didn't know what to do with that. He had expected a quiet life, a gentle transition into married life. But Maggie was no ordinary woman. She was strong, determined, and unapologetically herself. As he sat there, the sounds of the saloon continued to swirl around him. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. Everything felt different. The weight of his new life pressed down on him, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for it. But there was no turning back now. He was married to Maggie O'Connor, and somehow, he would have to figure out how to fit into this world she had created. He sighed, realizing that he was in for a journey he hadn't expected. And no matter what happened, there was no going back. The days that followed Nathaniel's arrival at the saloon were anything but easy. Despite his attempts to remain calm and composed, the weight of the situation seemed to press down on him more with each passing moment. Maggie, for all her confidence and assuredness, remained distant in a way that Nathaniel couldn't quite understand. She was always busy, managing the saloon with the energy of someone who had dedicated their whole life to it. It was her world, and Nathaniel had simply walked into it, uncertain of his place. For the first few days, Nathaniel spent his time observing, trying to learn the rhythms of the place, how the saloon operated, and what Maggie's role truly was. He had always assumed that running a business like this was something messy and chaotic, full of trouble and bad decisions. But that wasn't the case here. Maggie ran the saloon with a kind of quiet authority that surprised him. She didn't shout orders or create scenes. Instead, she moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, speaking to customers, settling disputes, and even joking with the regulars. She was always in control, but she never seemed to have to try. Nathaniel, however, was still trying to find his footing. He had been raised to act with decorum, to be respectful and well-mannered. And yet here, nothing seemed to follow those rules. People came and went as they pleased, laughing loudly and drinking well into the night. There were no quiet dinners, no peaceful evenings to sit and reflect in the way Nathaniel had imagined. It was loud, unpredictable, and full of energy, a world where rules didn't always apply. And in this world, Maggie was a queen, her reign unquestioned. One evening, after the last customers had left and the saloon had quieted down, Maggie turned to Nathaniel. He was sitting at the bar, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his glass. He had been trying to think of something to say, but words always seemed to escape him when she was around. Maggie, on the other hand, didn't seem to have that problem. She always knew exactly what to say, when to say it, and how to make people listen. "You don't have to just sit there, you know," she said, her voice breaking the silence. She was wiping down the counter, moving fluidly, her back straight, her face focused. She didn't look up at him, but Nathaniel could tell she was aware of his presence. Nathaniel looked up, startled by her words. He hadn't expected her to say anything to him. He wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm just not sure what I should do," he admitted quietly, his voice soft. Maggie paused for a moment, her gaze finally meeting his. Her eyes were sharp, appraising him, as if she were trying to figure out what made him tick. After a moment, she let out a small, almost amused laugh. "You don't have to know everything, Nathaniel. I didn't start out knowing how to run a saloon, you know. I learned along the way. So, relax. Take your time. You'll figure it out eventually." Nathaniel wasn't sure what to make of her words. He had always been someone who planned things out, who tried to control every detail of his life. But Maggie's life wasn't about control. It was about moving with the flow, adapting to what came her way, and handling things as they arose. That was something he had never been very good at. Maybe, Nathaniel said slowly. I don't want to learn how to run a saloon. Maggie didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she leaned against the bar, her arms crossed over her chest. That's fine, but you're here now. And whether you like it or not, this is your life now, so you might as well get used to it. Nathaniel opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He couldn't deny it, she was right. He was here now, and there was no going back. He had married her, and that meant he had to figure out how to live in this new world she had created for herself. Over the next few days, Nathaniel tried to find small ways to contribute, though he never felt entirely sure of what he was doing. He helped with the cleaning, wiped down tables, and tried to greet the regulars with a smile. But no matter how hard he tried, he felt out of place. The people here were different from the ones he was used to. They were loud, boisterous, and free in a way that Nathaniel had never experienced. They didn't care much for social status or what family you came from. It was all about the moment, about enjoying life, without worrying about the future. One evening, as the saloon filled up with the usual crowd, a man came in with a group of friends, laughing and shouting. He looked a little too drunk, a little too eager to make a scene. Maggie was already moving toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the situation. Nathaniel watched her, unsure of what was going to happen. Maggie didn't back down from anyone, and this man didn't seem to have any respect for her. The air grew tense as the man approached the bar, and Nathaniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What'll it be?" Maggie asked, her voice calm and collected, but there was an edge to it. The man leaned on the bar, grinning widely. "I'll have a drink, sweetheart," he said, his voice slurring. "And make it quick. My friends and I are getting impatient." Nathaniel could see the way Maggie's posture shifted, just slightly, but enough to show that she wasn't amused. "You'll get your drink when you show some respect," she said, her voice firm but not loud. The man seemed to take offense at her tone. He stood up straighter, his eyes narrowing. "Respect? You think you can talk to me like that?" Before Nathaniel could intervene, Maggie responded in the most unexpected way. She didn't raise her voice or back down. Instead, she reached over, grabbed the man's drink, and calmly poured it onto the floor. "There's your drink," she said, her voice low and steady. "Now, if you want another one, you can apologize for your behavior and start acting like a decent person." The man's face turned red with embarrassment, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation might escalate. But then, surprisingly, he backed down. He mumbled something under his breath and walked away, his friends following him in silence. Nathaniel stood there, stunned. He had never seen anyone handle a situation like that before. Maggie didn't raise her voice, didn't get physical, but she commanded respect in a way that left no room for argument. She had taken control of the situation without ever having to say more than a few words. Nathaniel couldn't help but admire her. It wasn't just her strength that impressed him, it was her confidence. She didn't have to prove herself to anyone. She was simply herself. That night, after the saloon had emptied and the doors were locked, Maggie finally looked at Nathaniel, a small, almost amused smile playing on her lips. "See? Not so bad, right?" Nathaniel shook his head, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know how you do it." Maggie shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "You just do. Life's messy. People are messy. But that's what makes it interesting. You can either be scared of it, or you can learn how to handle it. Your choice." Nathaniel thought about her words for a long time after that. There was something about Maggie that made everything feel a little bit easier, even though it was clear that nothing about her life was easy. She had learned to navigate the mess of the world, to embrace it, and to use it to her advantage. Maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel could learn to do the same. And with that thought in his mind, Nathaniel finally began to see the saloon in a new light, not as a place of chaos, but as a place full of possibilities. Maybe he wasn't as out of place as he had thought. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be a part of it. The days after that evening felt different to Nathaniel. There was a shift in the air, something that made him realize he couldn't keep hiding behind his discomfort and uncertainty. Maggie had made it clear that this was her world, and if he was going to be part of it, he needed to stop holding back. The saloon, with all its noise and chaos, was beginning to feel less like a foreign land and more like a place he might one day understand. But there was still so much about Maggie that confused him. One moment, she could be warm and almost playful, and the next, she was distant and cold. It was like she wore different masks, each one reflecting a different side of herself. Nathaniel never knew which version of Maggie he would get from day to day, and it left him feeling uneasy. Sometimes, he would catch her staring out the window, a faraway look in her eyes, and for a moment, it felt like she was a million miles away. Other times, she would joke around with the regulars, her laughter echoing through the room, completely in control of everything around her. But it wasn't just her moods that kept Nathaniel on edge. It was the way she pushed him, challenged him, without ever giving him a chance to catch his breath. She had a way of questioning everything he believed, every decision he had made up until now. At times, he felt like she was unraveling him, piece by piece, showing him parts of himself he didn't even know existed. And yet, there was something oddly exhilarating about it all. He had never felt so alive, so challenged. It wasn't until the night of the argument that Nathaniel realized just how much this new life had already changed him. It started out like any other evening. The saloon was bustling, filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft melody of a piano playing in the background. Maggie was behind the bar, as usual, moving effortlessly between customers. Nathaniel had been helping clean up, trying to stay out of the way, but he was beginning to feel more comfortable in his role. But then, a man walked in, one Nathaniel had never seen before. He was dressed in fine clothes, far more polished than the usual crowd. He walked straight up to the bar, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for something or someone. Maggie saw him immediately and froze, her expression hardening. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice smooth but carrying a sharp edge. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his gaze moving over the room again. "A woman by the name of Maggie O'Connor." Maggie didn't flinch, but Nathaniel could see the tension in her shoulders. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The man's smile faded slightly as he leaned closer. "I have some business with you," he said, his voice low. "And it's not the kind of business you can ignore." Nathaniel stood still, watching the interaction. He didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but the way Maggie's posture stiffened made him nervous. He could sense the change in the air. A subtle but unmistakable shift. Whatever this man wanted, it wasn't good. "Business?" Maggie repeated, her voice cool. "I'm afraid I don't do business with strangers." The man's smile returned, but this time it was laced with something darker. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," he said, taking a step closer. Nathaniel couldn't stand there any longer, not knowing what was happening. So he moved closer to the bar. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Maggie didn't look at him, but she spoke to him, her voice calm but firm. "Stay back, Nathaniel," she said. "This is none of your concern." Nathaniel didn't know what to do with her words. He was her husband, wasn't he? Shouldn't he be the one to help? But Maggie was making it clear that this wasn't his problem to solve. For the first time since they had been married, Nathaniel felt the weight of their difference in status. He was still an outsider in her world, no matter how much he tried to fit in. She didn't need his help, and she certainly didn't want it. The tension between Maggie and the man grew, and Nathaniel could feel his own frustration bubbling up. Who was this man? Why was he threatening Maggie? And why was she acting so calm, as if she had dealt with this kind of thing before? Maggie turned to face the man fully now, her expression serious. "If you're here to cause trouble," she said in a voice that cut through the noise of the room, "you'll leave now. You won't find what you're looking for here." The man didn't move. Instead, he took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just here to talk, Maggie," he said, his voice dripping with something that didn't feel right. "Just here to remind you of your past." At that, something in Maggie shifted. Her shoulders straightened, and her eyes darkened, with a look that Nathaniel had never seen before. Something fierce and dangerous. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice low, full of warning. "And if you don't leave, I'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, the man hesitated, as if weighing his options. But after a few seconds, he seemed to decide something in his mind. With a final look at Maggie, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence he left behind. Nathaniel stood there, stunned. He had never seen Maggie act like that before, and it left him shaken. As the door slammed shut behind the man, the tension in the room lifted, but Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened, something important. He looked at Maggie, unsure of what to say. She didn't look at him. Instead, she turned and began wiping down the counter, her movements mechanical. But Nathaniel could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the cloth just a little too tightly. She was trying to keep herself together, but it was clear that something had affected her deeply. Nathaniel wanted to ask her what had just happened, what that man had said to her, but he didn't. Something in her demeanor told him that this wasn't the time. So instead, he stayed silent, watching her as she worked, the weight of the evening settling over them both. A few minutes passed before Maggie finally spoke. Her voice soft, but with an edge of something hard behind it. "You don't have to worry about that man," she said, her tone almost distant. "He won't be back." Nathaniel nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Who was he?" he finally asked. Maggie's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment. And for the first time, Nathaniel saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that looked like pain, quickly hidden away. "Someone from my past," she said quietly. "Someone I don't want to talk about." Nathaniel didn't press her. He could tell that whatever it was something Maggie wasn't ready to share. And that was something he had to accept. As much as he wanted to know her completely, to understand the woman he had married, he also realized that Maggie had parts of herself that she kept hidden, pieces of her past that weren't for him to uncover. The rest of the night passed in quiet, tense silence. The saloon was emptying out, and the usual bustle had faded. Maggie continued cleaning, her movements more deliberate now, as if she were trying to shut everything out. Nathaniel stayed close, feeling the weight of his thoughts. He wanted to be there for Maggie, to offer support, but he didn't know how. He didn't know how to be the man she needed him to be. He felt like a stranger in his own life, standing on the edge of something deeper, but unsure how to step into it. And as the last customer left and the doors were locked for the night, Nathaniel knew one thing for certain. The road ahead was not going to be easy. But he was here now, and somehow, that had to count for something. As he turned to go upstairs, he couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The days that followed the confrontation with the man felt like a slow unraveling. Nathaniel still couldn't shake the tension in the air after that night. Maggie had closed herself off again, retreating into the calm and controlled version of herself that he had come to know. She didn't speak much about what had happened, and Nathaniel didn't press her. He had learned by now that there were parts of her life that she kept hidden, things she wasn't ready to share. But the distance between them felt different now. Deeper, somehow. Maggie's mood was unpredictable. Some days, she would smile and tease him as if nothing had changed. And other days, she would retreat into silence, lost in her own thoughts. Nathaniel had never known someone like her before, someone who was both an open book and a closed door all at once. It was like she had multiple layers to her, each one revealing a different part of who she was. And every time Nathaniel thought he was starting to understand her, she would slip away again, leaving him with more questions than answers. For Nathaniel, these past weeks had been a whirlwind. He had come to this saloon with no expectations, just a sense of duty. He had expected to spend his days in the background, quietly observing Maggie as she ran the business. But what he hadn't anticipated was the way she challenged him. The way her boldness made him question everything he had once believed about life, love, and his place in the world. He had been raised to follow the rules, to fit into a world that was neat, orderly, and predictable. But Maggie didn't live by those rules. She had created her own world, one that was messy, complicated, and full of surprises. And Nathaniel? He had been forced to live in it. Slowly, though, he was starting to realize that he was no longer the same man who had first stepped into the saloon. He had changed, whether he wanted to admit it or not. He had grown accustomed to the noise, the laughter, the clinking of glasses that filled the air every evening. He no longer flinched when the door swung open, and a new group of customers poured in. The unpredictability of the saloon had become a part of him, just like it had become a part of Maggie. One evening, as they were finishing up the last rounds of cleaning, Maggie came over to him, her face unreadable as she leaned against the bar. For a moment, she said nothing, just watching him with those sharp eyes of hers. Nathaniel had gotten used to her silences. But tonight, it felt different. There was something in her gaze that made his heart race, a quiet intensity that he couldn't quite explain. "I've been thinking," she said at last, her voice steady but carrying a hint of something deeper, something serious. Nathaniel looked up from where he was wiping down a table, sensing that this wasn't a casual conversation. "About what?" AF. She took a breath, her eyes still fixed on him. "About you. About us." Nathaniel froze, his stomach twisting. He had been expecting her to say something about the saloon or the customers, but not this. Not about them. He set the rag down slowly, wondering if this was the moment he had been dreading. The moment when Maggie would finally decide that she couldn't be married to someone like him. "What about us?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. Maggie's gaze softened for a brief moment before she straightened up, pushing herself off the bar. "I don't know," she said, almost to herself. "I've never done anything like this before. I've never had anyone in my life like you." Nathaniel didn't know how to respond. Was that a good thing? A bad thing? He couldn't tell. Maggie had always been so independent, so self-sufficient. The idea that she had never had someone like him in her life was both reassuring and confusing. "I don't know how to be the kind of husband you need," Nathaniel admitted, his voice low. It was the first time he had spoken those words aloud. But he had been feeling them for weeks. He had always been the kind of man who followed the rules, who played by the book. But here, in Maggie's world, nothing seemed to follow any rules at all. And it left him feeling lost. Maggie looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. For a second, Nathaniel thought she might say something cutting or dismissive, something that would make him retreat further into himself. But then, to his surprise, she smiled softly. Though, there was a hint of sadness in it. "You're trying too hard to be what you think I need," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to be perfect, Nathaniel. You just have to be you." His heart skipped a beat at her words. He had always felt like he was walking on thin ice, trying to meet her expectations, trying to be the man she needed him to be. But Maggie was telling him something different, something he hadn't expected. She didn't need him to change, to fit into some mold. She just needed him to be real. Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. "I don't know how to do that," he said honestly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie stepped closer to him, her eyes softening. "You don't have to know everything, Nathaniel. I don't have all the answers either. But we're in this together now, whether we like it or not. And that means we figure it out as we go." The words were simple, but they felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Maybe this wasn't going to be as difficult as he had thought. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe, just maybe, he could be himself. For the first time in a long while, Nathaniel allowed himself to relax. Just a little. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be someone he wasn't. He just needed to be here, with Maggie, and figure things out together. That night, after closing the saloon, they sat together in the quiet, their voices low, as they talked about everything and nothing. For once, the conversation wasn't about business or expectations or what came next. It was just two people, sharing the space between them, learning about each other in ways they hadn't before. As the days passed, Nathaniel found himself growing more comfortable in his new life. He began to see Maggie not as the person he was trying to understand, but as a woman who had her own past, her own struggles, and her own dreams. She was no longer a mystery to him, but someone he could slowly begin to know. And as for Maggie, she, too, seemed to open up more. The walls she had built around herself began to crack just a little, letting Nathaniel in. There were still moments of distance, of course, moments when she retreated into herself, but those moments became fewer and farther between. She trusted him more. Let him into her world, in a way she hadn't before. One evening, as they sat together after closing time, Maggie turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "I never expected any of this, but I think I'm glad it happened." Nathaniel looked at her, surprised by her words. "Glad?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah. I didn't think I needed anyone. I didn't think I could ever let anyone in. But you've made me see that maybe it's okay to need someone. Maybe it's okay to have someone by your side." 1. Nathaniel's heart swelled with emotion at her words. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He didn't have all the answers, and neither did Maggie. But they had each other, and somehow, that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Nathaniel and Maggie learned how to navigate this strange, messy, beautiful life they had found themselves in. They didn't always agree on everything, and they certainly didn't have it all figured out. But they had each other, and for now, that was all they needed. And in that moment, sitting together in the quiet of the saloon, Nathaniel realized that this unexpected journey, this life he had been thrown into, wasn't as bad as he had once thought. It was complicated, yes, but it was theirs. And somehow, that made all the difference.